Okay, thank you for joining us today for the webinar on weighing up the options for crops. My name's Ian McFarland and I'll be co-host with Philippa Clark tonight. Tonight wouldn't come about without support for Sheep Connect from the Australian Wool Innovation SA Sheep Industry Fund. More information on Sheep Connect is available on our website. Tonight is also supported by the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin NRM Board through funding through the Australian Government's National Landcare Program and NRM levies. So we thank them for that support as well. There's a couple of upcoming events, a couple more webinars. We've got one on sire evaluation in SA next week. So look on the website to register for that. We've also got one coming up in early October around stock theft and farm security. So SA Police, Condinin Group, will be talking on that. There's a workshop down at Kangaroo Inn in the southeast on ramping up repro. So all of those events are available for registration online at sheepconnectsa.com.au. So tonight's presenter is Mick Faulkner. Mick's the principal consultant with AgriLink Consultants based out of Wortham. Mick has a wealth of knowledge in cropping systems and we look forward to his presentation tonight.
Okay, thanks Ian and welcome. I wish it was in better circumstances, to be honest, but I guess what it is what it is, and we just have to keep on making the best decisions we can possibly make. So what are the options for droughted and frosted crops? Firstly, it has to be, I guess we know that we're droughted at the moment, and in most parts of the state from in the northern areas, that's the Northern Mallee, the northern agricultural areas and northern Eyre Peninsula. It's been dry for a long time, and it's pretty easy to see. Over the last couple of weeks, we've had frost on top of that, but the management decisions for frosted and droughted crops may be somewhat different. So when we are planning for what we might do, and I think we all do this innately, what options are available, what considerations need to be made, how do we actually set up a plan? Are there some trigger points that we need to that can really alert us about when we make decisions and how we go about it? What's needed to implement the plan, and can the plan actually be delivered? We don't want to have some goals that we actually can't achieve. So obviously the options, I think they're pretty obvious. There's a grain harvest. There's cut for silage, and I honestly think for most areas this year that and just the way farming systems are set up, that silage isn't really an option. So I'm going to skip over silage in this talk. Cutting for hay, grazing with limited intervention. So that basically means putting livestock and particularly sheep into a paddock, and then grazing with different levels of intervention. That may require just a higher management input. There's also spray topping and grazing a standing crop. So we're talking about not using the feed at the moment, but saving it for some time later, but also getting the benefit of weed control in the paddock. And then there's just do nothing and put the header in it if rain happens to occur. So what considerations need to be made? I think the first one, and it's one that we're often, once again, we may know it innately, but just by viewing the crop, but really I find it useful still to measure it, and that's how much biomass is present. It's critical that we know within reason, I suggest within 10 to 20%, because then we can help make the right decisions. That will drive if there's a hay potential, but can hay be made? there's, do we have the facilities? Do we have the equipment? Do we have the storage? Do we have the market for hay? Can it be stored without spontaneous combustion? It is an issue with obviously droughted crops and frosted crops that they are very, very difficult to cure. And it's not that that it's just all free moisture. There's actually some bound moisture. So within the atoms of the plant, between atoms, that actually is very, very difficult to get out of the plant. So in some cases, it's almost impossible, I think, to produce it and get the moisture down low enough to be comfortable to be putting it into sheds, say in very dense bales. What grain yield can be achieved? Currently, what's our estimate? Realistically, what are we going to get? And then optimistically, if we're going to leave it, optimistically, if we did happen to get a rain, and unfortunately it doesn't look all that likely, but not to say it won't happen, what is the optimistic outlook if there is one? Is it harvestable anyway? Many paddocks are, at the start of the year, they may have rocks. The intake into the header front is going to be adequate to make sure it actually is harvestable. And there are many other issues with harvest. If it's going to be grazed, how will the paddock or more than one paddock be grazed, and what class of stock is going to be used for grazing, and which are the most important stock? And honestly, is there any willpower left to follow any of the options? So we certainly understand that the discussions around the kitchen table might say, especially after 2 years of this, for many might be saying, I just don't know if I can. What are the trigger points? Obviously, soil water is critical. Rainfall received for the growing season, so you get an idea of where you are in terms of soil moisture if you're not actually measuring it. The winter rainfall, the forecast rainfall and forecast temperatures, frost damage, how much feed is in the alternative pasture paddocks, and in some cases that is getting very, very low, and any more grazing there's not much dry matter left, and there's a hell of an erosion risk, so it may be worth grazing some of the cereals to actually protect the existing pasture paddocks, and just a realisation, I suppose, is a trigger point that crops just aren't going to make it, and to see what is the best option, knowing that they're not going to make it. So as I said before, assessing that biomass is actually critical, and the most accurate way that I've found that you can spend hours doing it, or you can do it pretty quickly. And I think in most paddocks, go to an area that you think is low biomass. Go and take 2 rows at 30 centimetre per row, so just a 30 centimetre ruler, lay it down between 2 rows, and then cut to ground level on either side of that ruler. Throw that into a paper or plastic bag, and then go to an area that you think is probably average for the paddock, and do it similarly, and then go to an area of high biomass, where you think it's the better part of the paddock, and do that again. So you'll end up with 3 samples, each of 2 rows by 30 centimetres. Weigh each sample, and that will give you the wet weight. Dry the samples. Now, this is the hard bit. They do have to be dried down to 0, else we're going to make a mistake with that estimate of how much biomass there is. I suggest use a microwave oven until the sample feels dry. Now, what normally that might mean is you put the sample in a paper bag, leave it in its paper bag, or put it into a microwave-proof container, put it in probably initially for 2 minutes, and then just take it out, stir the sample, put it back in, maybe for another 2, take it out, stir it, put it back maybe for another 1, and you'll get the hang of it after a while as it's getting very, very close to dry. You don't want to burn the sample. When it feels dry, you're almost there. So take the sample out of the microwave, place it in the kitchen oven for about 30 minutes at 90 to 100 degrees, and that'll make sure that the moisture that is inside the plant, in nodes and things like that, that hasn't been able to be dried by the microwave action is actually done in the oven. Then weigh the samples again, and this will give you the dry weight. Enter the weights, the row spacing, and the length of the cut rows into a website calculator. And there's probably many of these on the web, but AgVic has one that's easy to use. So just go onto the AgVic site, home, agriculture, grains and other crops, grains calculators, dry matter calculator, and you'll see it there. This is how it comes up. So it gives you an example in the bottom half of this of the screen. You actually put your sample weight in there of the green sample, and then the sample weight of the dry. And just remember, I should have said that you've combined your 3 samples into one now. That'll automatically spit out a dry matter percentage. In the next row, you enter your row spacing and the length of the cut row. So in the case I suggested was 30 centimetres, the number of rows cut, and we're taking 2 on either side of the ruler, but we're doing that 3 times across the paddock. So there's actually 6 rows cut. That will then automatically calculate the area and the dry matter yield. In the next slide, this is one that I entered yesterday. So the sample weight prior to drying was 490 grams. Dry weight was 93, so it gave a 19% dry matter, which you would expect in a crop that's post or roundabout anthesis or thereabouts. It would be a lower dry matter percentage if it's at flag leaf or earlier. Row spacing in this example was 10 inches or 25 centimetres. We took 30 centimetres of row when we cut 6 rows, which is 0.45 of a square metre, and that's calculated the dry matter for us at 2.07 tonne per hectare. Now, there's going to be error, as we know, but honestly, if we're within 10 to 15%, I think that's getting us where we want to be, rather than having a guess. So then we need to look at the options. And so we need to look at the dry matter, and then hay, the grazing options, and the grain harvest estimates. Now, this table is just something I've created, so take it for what it's worth. It's not 100% accurate, and it's not 100% tested. On the left-hand side, we have the biomass, which we would have calculated from that AgVic site. And here I've used from less than 1,000 kilograms per hectare up to greater than 5,000. I've made an estimate of hay yield, and those estimates of hay yields change depending on how much biomass there is. The recovery of hay from low biomass is lower because you simply can't get it all up off the ground if you do happen to cut it, and the percentage of uncut material is greater in a shorter crop. So, for example, at 1,000 kilograms per hectare of biomass, the estimate is around about 600 kilograms per hectare of hay. The grain yield for 1,000 kilograms per hectare of biomass is estimated once again at a harvest index of 30%. So assuming, therefore, that it has had some drought stress, and so therefore the harvest index has dropped to something like 30%. I think with the help of with your own knowledge or your advisor, you could actually change that a little. I suspect this year from the paddocks I've seen that harvest indexes will be lower than last year, because last year the dry started earlier and the biomass was limited right from the start. And in fact, harvest indexes were very, very good last year, usually around about 40% or more. So I don't see that happening this year. Then I've put two columns there, planned graze and paddock graze. How I differentiate them is planned graze is hopefully nothing too complex, but it takes a little bit of management, and that is with watering points and perhaps some temporary fencing, whether that be electric fencing or just some temporary fencing. And paddock grazing is simply just opening the gate and letting the sheep in. So then I've added to the table, and I think you're all capable and may want to do this yourself. What sort of intervention is the most suited? So at less than 1,000 kilograms per hectare, I think there's only two choices, and that is you either graze it or you do nothing. And so the right-hand part of this table is which intervention is the most appropriate. And as I said, these are my opinions. Yours may be somewhat different. At 1,000 kilograms per hectare, grazing is still probably the best option. There is an option to harvest. If the grain yield's going to be in the order of 300 kilos, it may be worth, for some people, to run the header over it just to pick up what's there. And no action still rates reasonably strongly. But grazing is, I believe, the best option. At 2 tonne to the hectare, grazing is still a good option, and harvest is a good option. And you will notice that I haven't rated it for hay yet. Other people may be able to make a viable decision to produce hay at 2 tonne to the hectare, but I struggle to make it fit. At 3 tonne to the hectare of total biomass, grazing still is up there quite strongly. Hay starts to certainly make a presence, and harvest becomes a really viable option. At 4 tonne to the hectare, grazing starts to lose its appeal, not because it's not much good, it's just simply that the other options of hay and harvest may be more lucrative or a better option for some, considering that it's also then going to provide stubble for further grazing. At 5 tonne to the hectare, grazing is difficult. Hay is a very, very much an option, and probably a better option than harvest, given that the harvest yields are not increasing as much as the hay yields. And greater than 5 tonne to the hectare, it's really going to be hay or harvest. I hope you find that table useful, and certainly you should be able to adjust that for how you see your own property. How do we actually set up a grazing plan? Well, the nutritionists, livestock nutritionists, will be far better than this at me. So I see it from a sheep management and a farm management point of view. So, what are the livestock requirements? Are you after growth? Are you looking after some breeding stock, or are you just trying to have a maintenance ration for the stock? What are the opportunities? And for some people that will be for their lambs, maybe for others to take on some adjustment, and others just to keep the stock in as good a condition to meet the market requirements. What restrictions exist? Certainly, labour is one of those. A grazing plan has to consider what labour is available, considering you're also going into a part of the year where other pastures need managing, where crops are looking at being cut for hay, and harvest is just around the corner. So labour resources need to be able to work the plan. Have you got the management in place to do it? Is there water available and water resources? Fencing? Have you got the time? And just by doing all this, does it make it even a little bit worse that you may need a higher energy ration later on? And it might have been better just to move some stock on at this point of time. What physical aspects are important? And I guess for a lot of areas, the erosion risk is key. There's very little ground cover in some areas. And I think we can see from some parts of, especially the Victorian Mallee, how difficult it is once things are on the move, and you know, it's going to take some time to get for those people to get cover again if they let it get too low. So I think erosion risk needs to be in the back of everyone's mind. Also, very low levels of soil cover for water infiltration. I don't know how everyone would view that, especially at this time of the year, but it may become important if we run right through summer and autumn next year with low levels of soil cover, and we on heavy soils we're not getting the water infiltration, and therefore not being able to store the water for next year as well. And dust in houses, whether they're our own houses, and certainly one of my colleagues in Western Australia, the biggest risk, it's not a big risk I suppose, but it really annoys everyone, and they've had to put hay bales around their house just to stop the dust. This is what I call paddock grazing. It's just an example. So if this was a 120 hectare paddock, and the rough dimensions are 1,200 metres by 1,000 metres. On the calculations I did earlier, at 2 point, I can't quite remember, just over 2 tonnes a hectare, that would have 248 tonnes of dry matter in that paddock. And the assumptions are it's about 55% recovery for paddock grazing, which leaves us with 136 tonnes of utilisable dry matter. The reason why there's 55% recovery is that the stock, and if you follow my cursor, if our watering point is down here, so in the top left corner, that stock actually have to drink from that watering point, but they're grazing elsewhere. So in the initial stages, they don't need much water, so they'll just tend to graze out from the watering point, and then later on, when the moisture percentage of the feed is lower, and it's much hotter, that's when they'll go to the extremities of the paddock. And so they're going to use an awful lot of energy walking between water and their feed. So it can be done, but it doesn't really provide the best opportunity in terms of providing the best utilisation of the feed. So if we have the same paddock, but we put an imaginary line to start with, and make it 4 by 30 hectare paddocks. So still the 1,200 metres by 1,000 metres. We've still got the 248 tonnes of dry matter, but we can now assume there's 80% recovery for the paddock grazing, because we're going to do it differently. That then creates 198 tonnes of utilisable dry matter. And what does it require? Well, it requires maybe, and maybe only, a small watering point at this time of the year, to the far end of the paddock. And in a lot of cases, unless you're using lactating ewes or it gets very hot, there isn't a great requirement for any water for the stock. So they'll be able to graze without much water. And it requires 1,000 metres of electric or some sort of temporary fences. And I think we all know that we don't care if a few stock get on the wrong side of the fence. As long as 90% of them are on that side of the fence, we're doing the job. So it doesn't have to be the best fencing system in the world. And all of a sudden, we've created another 30 or 40 tonne of dry matter, and we've created a more efficient animal because they're not walking so far to get their energy. The second way, the next step is just to shift that fence, shift it to halfway down the paddock. The stock will graze out from that small watering point again if they need water. They will have a bit of a preference once they've gone for their first walk to go back if there's going to be any new growth on the original quarter of the paddock. So on the right-hand side up here, they will have a bit of preference if there is new growth to keep on grazing that new growth, but I suspect just at the moment there's not going to be too much new growth. So that's pretty simple system, and then shifting it once again to the left, and ultimately just taking it away. So that's the most simple modified grazing that I can think of. We could, however, after the first grazing, put another barrier in behind between the first grazing and where we're now grazing. That would mean double the amount of electric fencing, but it certainly saves overgrazing and too much walking between feed and water, and would probably have some sort of efficiency as well. So that's how I wanted to end it, but I really want to open it up to as many questions as possible, and we'll see how we go about answering them.
Great, thanks, Mick. That was amazing, very, very in depth.
Oops.
We've got one that's come in earlier on. One of our producers has had frosted wheat crop, and he's just trying to decide whether it's going to be better just to graze it or cut it for hay.
Can I ask if there's sufficient biomass, and once again that does vary from farmer to farmer, is about the economic level or the amount of biomass they will have before it's economic or desirable to cut. And as I said in my example, if I were in a heavier soil in the mid-north, there's a bit of a reluctance probably, I suppose, to cut below 3 tonne per hectare of a droughted crop. But a frosted crop is going to have actually better quality hay. It's going to be extremely good quality normally, as long as you can get it baled, and you can avoid spontaneous combustion. So I think if there's a biomass issue, how much you have got before you make the decision, and can you make really good hay that's not going to put you at risk. I don't know how many people use Hay Guard or Hay King or any other preservative, but if you're actually baling into high density bales and putting them in your own shed, it really is worth the investment on a frosted crop to use those products. If you're using round bales that are field stored, you probably wouldn't need it because there'd be enough air movement and the density is much lower anyway. I don't know if I was particularly answered the question, because I'd love to see the crop first. But if the option is between hay and grazing, then I'd really love to see the electric fencing or something else go out there, because a frosted crop is going to stay green for quite some time. I reckon with planned grazing that there's probably 6 to 8 weeks of grazing left there, whereas with open paddock grazing it would be lucky to be half that. So just how's it going to be grazed, rather than just how much dry matter is there, I think. A long way around of not answering the question.
Yeah. There's another couple have come through here. One is Monday's hot north wind caused a lot of green leaf area to be lost instantly, with all the leaves tipped, flag rolled or burned off. What is the quality implications when the leaf area is lost in this manner?
Okay, obviously when it's burnt off like that, photosynthesis is going to stop from those leaves. So your photosynthesis is going to come from other parts of the plant, so green stems or leaves further down in the canopy. And I'm assuming that the hot wind burning was just mostly on the flag leaf, but there could be moisture or loss of leaf area and colour from moisture lower down in the canopy as well. So the question is, with the flag rolled or burned, what is the quality implication? Quality of hay or grazing? I don't think there's much impact on the quality of grazing. If the awns are emerged, then and it's post flowering, you probably find that initially the sheep will go through and they may nip a few heads off, but they're probably and Tristan's replied, hay quality. Visually, pretty ordinary, Tristan. But in terms of feed quality, it'll be pretty damn good because the water soluble carbohydrates will generally be high, even though it's not photosynthesizing anymore. The stored ones will be quite high, and the fibre fractions will naturally be low because it hasn't been able to build up an awful lot of biomass. It hasn't put a lot into lignin and hemicellulose. So I suspect while it will look awful, perhaps before you cut it, when it gets in the bale, it'll probably look pretty good, and when you feed it to your stock, they'll love it.
Great, thanks, Mick. We've got another one here. In regards to a drought-affected crop where hay is not an option, by the time you give up on the crop, it's already out and head. Once the crop is out and head, and the sheep are not likely to be interested in eating it properly, are you better off letting it ripen before grazing so that they can get the benefit of the grain and are more likely to eat it?
Yeah, either way, I think. If you put the stock in it, and I've seen it many times, and I just mentioned it in answer to Tristan's question as well, that the stock will go in. You're right, they probably won't want to eat the head, but they'll eat all the leaves off, and you still may actually be able to harvest it. So I'd say, yeah, don't get too fussed about the fact that it's out in head. They'll eat what they want to eat, and they'll leave what they don't want. So, and what I'm saying is, that if it's got awns, they won't want it. Conversely, I think that's why the industry at the moment is developing some awnless wheats, because it's less of a deterrent than awns for this dual purpose approach. So I don't know whether I'm answering your question again, but if you wanted the feed now, I would actually put the stock in. You may reduce the stocking rate a little in that situation, and you may still be able to put them out there again. So take them out when they've done their job eating leaves and lower tillers. That won't probably come to anything now. Let them do that. They'll trample a bit down, we know that, but then when the crop matures, if you want to put them back in, that there'll be grain there for them to eat as well.
Another one here, pros and cons of cutting methods. For example, say draper fronts versus mower conditioner in light crop scenarios.
Yeah.
Your thoughts there?
If we say a light crop scenario, and I'm assuming that's less than 2 tonne per hectare biomass, so whoever asked the question can post that if I'm making the wrong assumption, just let us know on the question and answer. So if it's less than 2 tonne to the hectare of biomass, it's everyone would love to see a mower conditioner in every case, but it's not going to happen. I realise that because you only have a 16 or an 18 foot cut, and and that's going to drop a fair bit of it onto the ground in small, narrow windrows. So I understand, yes, it's probably the best way to cut hay, but you may not be able to recover it all. Cutting with a draper or a windrower, yes, it creates the bulk, but it's not cured. So there's no crimping. It will take a long time, especially if the bound water or bound water levels are high, and they're not like, we can't actually measure those, but we just know that when it's put out there, it takes an awful long time to cure. So if you're going to use a windrower or a draper front, it would be ideal to use Hay King or Hay Guard with the baler. I don't know how many would have applicators, but at least you know you're not going to have spontaneous combustion. So you don't have to get down to 14% or lower for moisture. You can comfortably bale at 16 or 18%, and know that the bound water is not going to cause you a problem, as well as the unbound water. So, or if you're using round bales, they are far less dense. Plus, the way they're stored, you don't have a big dense pile of bales. Yes, you have more losses, and I understand that, but they are, they're safe to store. They're, as I said, low density. There's air movement around them all the time, so it's not as if you're like a shed where you take out one bale and that lets air in, and that oxygen is just the fuel that the hay's been waiting for. With round bales, you don't have that. Once again, a bit of a nondescript answer, but just take a lot of care. If you're going to do windrow or draper front hay, just make sure you can get it as cured as possible. And if you're struggling to get it cured, think about round bales or Hay Guard or Hay King. What's the minimum density that you consider cutting for hay? And I think if you actually go back to that table, I reckon it's pretty much in there. And I know last year that I, with my own little farm, we cut 1.4 tonnes per hectare of hay, and last year was probably the only year that would have broken even. This year, I'd be thinking more likely 2 tonnes per hectare. I'd be reluctant to cut much below 2 tonnes per hectare. And just thinking about the market, if you're going to use it yourself, you know where the market is. If you're going to be selling it, just remember that all that stuff went to New South Wales last year, and to the droughted areas, that there's not the liquidity there this year that there was last, and there's a marketing risk, or a payment risk, I think, and that may well keep a lid on prices. I just don't know, but I certainly know some of the banks are saying that they're reluctant to allow their farmers in some of those areas to purchase more hay.
We might close things off now. Mick, I'd like to thank you for your insight into current situation and sharing your expertise. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on today's webinar. Tonight wouldn't come about without support for Sheep Connect from the Australian Wool Innovation SA Sheep Industry Fund. More information on Sheep Connect is available on our website. There's a couple of upcoming events, a couple more webinars. We've got one on sire evaluation in SA next week. So look on the website to register for that. We've also got one coming up in early October around stock theft and farm security. So SA Police, Candidin Group, and Graze will be talking on that. There's a workshop down at Kangaroo Inn in the southeast on ramping up repro. So all of those events are available for registration online at sheepconnectsa.com.au.